At midnight on September 17, 1944, the night sky over the eastern border of the Netherlands was ripped apart by tracer fire, shredding the darkness into jagged ribbons of crimson. Sergeant Tony Rosa could still feel the scorching heat where flak had slammed into the transport plane's fuselage. In the next instant, a violent jolt hurled him toward the open door, and the wind clawed at his face. "Jump! Jump! Jump!" The jump master's roar was crushed under the engines. Tony locked his elbows, checked the man in front of him, and forced his mind back to procedure. Hook up, look, count. He clenched his teeth, yanked the ripcord, and the lines snapped tight with a force that nearly tore his shoulder out. For a heartbeat he spun, blind in the slipstream. Then the canopy caught, and the world steadied into a steep, cold descent. Tony forced his eyes open. The friendly canopy field that should have been dense as stars was nowhere to be seen. Only a handful of parachutes tumbled in the turbulent air like scraps of cloth thrown away by the wind. Damn it, we drifted. He fought down the dizziness, corrected his body angle, and tried to read the ground through broken cloud. The blurred shapes below sharpened as he dropped. This was not the open ground outside Arnhem they had planned for. It was a flat clearing ringed by forest, darker than ink at the edges. Along one side stood several low brick buildings, their windows black. Only the wind moved through the trees, moaning like something wounded. Tony hit hard, rolled, and came up on one knee. The landing jarred his teeth. He ripped free of his harness, hauled his chute down into the brush, and drew his M1A1 carbine. He kept his voice low and urgent, as if the night itself could listen. Rally up now." Shapes moved through wet grass and shadow. 5 other paratroopers emerged, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. Mud and grass clung to their jumpsuits. Their faces were tight with shock and the aftertaste of falling. "Sound off," Tony whispered. One by one they answered. No one was missing, but everyone looked rattled. Private Miller, the navigator, lifted a compass with a cracked face, as if the broken glass could explain the error. "Sergeant, we're off course at least 20 kilometers, Miller said, voice unsteady. "We should be right on the Dutch-German border, and the radio is dead. It hit a tree on the way down. No signal at all." Tony felt his stomach drop. On the first day of Operation Market Garden, airborne troops were meeting far more resistance than anyone had promised. Their 6-man reconnaissance team had been tasked to slip ahead, find German fire positions, and mark them for the main force. Instead, they were cut off, deep in enemy territory, with no clean way to report anything back. He pressed a hand to his headset anyway. The ear cups gave him nothing but silence. Then came a low, heavy engine note in the distance, growing closer. Under it, the harsh scrape of metal on metal. The sound was not friendly, not lost, not uncertain. It was purposeful. "German patrol?" Carter murmured. The older man pointed into the trees. "At least one truck, maybe an armored vehicle." Tony motioned everyone down behind bushes at the edge of the clearing. He pulled them into a shallow line, muzzle disciplined tight, fingers off triggers. Under thin moonlight, he finally understood where they had landed. It was a schoolyard, a boarding school's athletic field, enclosed by a wall more than 2 meters high. The main building was a 3-story red brick block, square and stern. By the entrance hung a signboard with Dutch lettering, blurred and unreadable at this distance. The place looked asleep, but sleep was a thin cover in occupied territory. "We cannot fight here," Tony said, making the call in seconds. "This is civilian ground. If shooting starts, people inside get caught in it. And if the Germans call reinforcements, we are trapped." "What do we do then?" Miller asked, his muzzle trembling. Tony shook his head and studied the wall. Breaking out over that wall exposes us. And this area is swamp and forest. We don't know the ground. We'll die faster. Headlights pierced gaps in the trees and swept the ground, throwing restless shadows. The engine sound swelled. Tony inhaled once, deep, and made the decision that tasted like iron. "We take control of the school," he said. The word hung there, harsh and heavy. "Not occupy, control," he corrected, voice cold and steady. "We need a temporary hide. We also need the people inside to keep silent. Listen carefully. No one hurts anyone without my order, and that includes civilians. If a weapon comes up, it comes up because I say so." The men exchanged looks and nodded. They did not like it, but they understood the math. They moved in a tight formation along the wall to the main entrance. The gate was not locked. Tony eased it open, held it so it would not creak, and led them inside. On the first floor, the assembly hall was washed in pale moonlight spilling through stained glass windows. Rows of wooden benches stood in perfect lines. The air smelled of chalk dust and old books, and something else underneath, the faint damp of a building that had been closed too long. A scream broke from upstairs, thin and terrified. Then hurried footsteps and panicked whispers. Tony lifted a hand and froze the team. He listened. More steps, a candle flame. Then voices, hushed and urgent. A cluster of children in nightclothes came down the stairs with a few adults carrying candles. At the front walked an elderly man with gray hair and a formal suit. He gripped a Bible so tightly his knuckles showed white. The children saw the guns and shrank together. The adults' faces were rigid with fear, the kind that comes from living under occupation and knowing what soldiers can do. "Who are you?" the old man demanded. His voice shook, but it held. "This is a neutral place, no shooting." Tony lowered his weapon and forced calm into his tone. "We are American paratroopers. We only need to hide for a short time. We won't harm you." His eyes caught the school emblem pinned to the man's lapel. Understanding landed. "You're Headmaster Martins." The headmaster did not answer. He stared at Tony as if weighing the man's soul and measuring the danger he brought through the door. Outside, the engine noise reached the front of the school. Headlight beams slid across the field and lit the hall windows. Tony could feel time collapsing toward a single point. He turned to Private Jones. "Jones, take the young woman to the next room. Keep her with you. Do not mistreat her. No threats you can't take back." Tony indicated a woman in her 20s in the group, pale-faced, wearing a simple dress. She clutched a folder to her chest. A teacher, most likely, and the only adult who looked as if she might argue instead of simply freeze. "What are you doing?" Headmaster Martins stepped forward to block Jones. Tony raised a hand and stopped him. His voice dropped, forceful and controlled. "Headmaster, there are 2 disasters in front of us." He held the older man's gaze. "First, the Germans find us here. Shooting starts. Your students, your teachers, and my men die. No one walks away. Second, you help us hide for a short time. We guarantee no one here is harmed. When the Germans leave, we leave." He paused, letting the words settle into the room, then made the threat explicit because time did not allow gentle lies. "If you refuse, the first disaster begins now because of that woman. I do not want to hurt her, but I must keep my men alive long enough to complete our mission." It was not a boast, it was a cold equation. 6 soldiers and their orders on one side. A school full of civilians on the other. Holding the teacher was the only leverage that could break the standoff without immediate gunfire. The headmaster swayed as if struck. His eyes flicked toward the room where Jones had taken the teacher. Then he looked back at the children behind him, trembling in the candlelight. Pain and fury clouded his face, and Tony felt the shame of the tactic like grit under his tongue. Outside, vehicles stopped, boots hit concrete, German voices called out. Each second passed like a blunt blade sawing through the air. Finally, Headmaster Martins closed his eyes and drew a long breath. When he opened them again, the anger had not vanished, but exhaustion lay over it like ash. "I agree," he said, voice hoarse, "but you will keep your promise. You will not harm a single child or a single teacher." Tony nodded once and extended his hand. "Deal. Now tell me where we can hide, and tell me the patrol routine here." The headmaster did not take the hand. He turned toward the stairs. "Follow me. There is a storage room in the basement. Not large." Tony gestured for the team to move, leaving Carter to watch the entrance. In the dark corridors, Tony could feel the civilian's fear pressing into his back. He could feel his men's nerves stretched tight as wire. He also knew the cooperation he had forced into existence was as fragile as paper. One wrong movement and it would tear. The basement storeroom was narrow and damp, heavy with the sour stink of potatoes and pickled vegetables. Crates of textbooks and battered teaching tools were stacked along the walls. It would barely hold 6 soldiers, and it offered no plan beyond not being seen. Tony put them to work anyway. Clear a space. Weapons close. No talking. Then he followed Headmaster Martins back up to the first-floor corridor. Carter still guarded the door, ear close to the wood, eyes sharp. "The patrol passes every night," the headmaster whispered. "About once every half hour. They stop for 10 minutes, check nearby houses for anything unusual. With Market Garden, they're more aggressive. They're looking for infiltrators." Tony nodded, filing it away, and started to ask about the officer in charge when a heavy knock slammed the front door. A rough German shout followed. "Open up! Routine inspection!" The knocking became pounding, the butt of a rifle hammering the wood. The door shuddered. Carter lifted his weapon and looked to Tony for the order. "Do not open," Tony said. "We stall." He turned to the headmaster. "You answer them. Tell them the children are asleep. Say you will come to the door in a moment. Keep them talking. Keep them outside." Headmaster Martins went pale, but he forced himself forward and called back in Dutch. The German shouting paused for a moment. The engine outside did not die, and Tony could feel the patrol's impatience building. "We need them to believe there's nothing here," Tony said, mind racing. "The basement is not a solution. If they force the door, we're caught." The headmaster's hands twisted together. "We could hide all the children and staff in the cellar. It's deep. There is a concealed door. They might not find it." "No," Tony said immediately. "That turns it into a trap. If they find the entrance, no one escapes. And concealed doors leave marks. If they search carefully, they will see it." The headmaster's eyes darted, desperate for anything. "Work clothes. We have a few sets. You change and pretend you're repairmen. I tell them the water pipes broke and you're fixing them." Tony looked at his men's gear, the weapons, the bulk of their equipment. "We carry too much, and repairmen do not fix pipes at midnight with rifles. It will not hold." Outside, the Germans shouted again. A kick thudded into the door. The wood trembled. Headmaster Martins sagged onto a corridor bench, covering his face. "It's over," he muttered. "Everything is over." Tony did not have time for comfort. He moved to a window and pulled the curtain back a finger's width. 3 German trucks sat at the school gate. More than a dozen soldiers stood with rifles near the vehicles. An officer was speaking into a radio, face tight and grim, the kind of man who treated routine like a battlefield because routine was where mistakes got you killed. A headlight beam swept the yard and caught a guard standing near a truck. The soldier reacted instantly, trained by reflex. He dropped low, rolled under the truck, and stayed there until the light moved on. Then he crawled out, brushed himself off, and returned to his post. The movement struck Headmaster Martins like a shock. He lurched to his feet, grabbed Tony's arm, and hissed, "I have a way." They are soldiers. Their minds are full of drills and orders. They recognize military behavior. Tony frowned. What are you thinking? We show them a drill, the headmaster said, eyes bright with frantic hope. An air raid drill. Tony stared. An air raid drill? Yes, the headmaster said quickly. Allied bombers pass often. The Germans have been ordering civilians to practice air raid procedures. You pretend you are Volkssturm instructors sent to train the school. It will look messy and loud and believable, and they will not have time to dig into details. It was insane, but Tony could not find a better option in the seconds he had left. All right, he said, we do it. He leaned closer, voice tight. Get everyone dressed and out on the field. Tell them if they follow instructions, they live. We need props, old helmets, an air raid siren, anything. We have them, Headmaster Martins said, already moving. The storeroom has old civil defense helmets and a hand-cranked siren. Tony turned to Carter. Carter, get those props. Then get the men into whatever old clothes you can find. Paratrooper uniforms and weapons go into the basement crates. Cover them with books and tools. Move. Yes, Sergeant. Tony turned to Jones. Bring the teacher back. She participates. Tell her this is the only way everyone survives. Jones nodded and moved fast. The school erupted into controlled chaos. Under the headmaster's orders, teachers and children scrambled into daytime clothing and hurried out to the field, terrified and confused. Tony's men pulled on old work jackets and shirts from closets and storage. They hid their jumpsuits, radios, and weapons in wooden crates downstairs, then covered the crates with textbooks and broken classroom equipment like someone trying to bury a secret under ordinary life. Carter returned carrying a box of dented helmets and the hand-cranked siren. Hands shook as the helmets were passed out. There was no time to rehearse. Tony spoke low and fast to soldiers and civilians alike, using a cadence that cut through panic. When the siren goes, you run to the center like you are panicking, he said. Push, cry, shout. The messier it looks, the better. We stand as instructors and wave you around. Do not stare at the Germans. Do not speak to them. You do not answer questions. You just run. You keep running until I stop you. The headmaster flinched at the wording but nodded because there was no other door to open. Then the gate crashed open. A dozen German soldiers poured in with rifles up. The officer at the front raised a pistol and barked, "No one move! What is this?" Headmaster Martins stepped forward, forcing a stiff smile. In German, he said, "Herr Offizier, an air raid drill. Volkssturm instructors ordered it. Allied bombers have been frequent. We must be ready." His voice trembled, but he held it. Tony could see the sweat on the headmaster's temple, even in weak light. The officer's eyes narrowed. He scanned the field, the panicked civilians, the three instructors issuing shouted gestures. He looked for the small things, discipline where there should be none, fear where there should be defiance. "Volkssturm instructors," he said with a cold edge, "I know nothing of this order. Papers, now!" Tony felt his throat tighten. He stepped forward, keeping his face still and his hands visible. In rough, accented German, he said, "Herr Offizier, it was a last-minute order. Papers are at the camp. It was urgent, so we came immediately to begin training." The officer studied Tony, as if searching for the seam where the lie would split. Then he snapped his hand and sent two soldiers toward the main building. "I will inspect personally," he said. "If you are lying, I will shoot every one of you." Tony's pulse hammered. If those soldiers reached the basement and lifted the wrong crate lid, the night would end in screams. He kept his chin level, forcing his body not to react. Then the forest to the west lit up with a sudden blast. A huge explosion boomed, throwing a column of fire into the sky and washing the horizon in orange. A German soldier came running, breathless, and saluted the officer. "Herr Offizier, 3 kilometers northwest, a fresh drop zone. Blood and abandoned equipment. The explosion is likely abandoned ammunition igniting. A paratrooper team is moving toward the border. The officer's face changed instantly. The chaos in the schoolyard became what it appeared to be, civilian noise. The real target was northwest. He cursed and spoke into his radio, spitting orders. "All men to the trucks! Move! Now! We go northwest!" The soldiers snapped into motion, rifles down, boots pounding. Before climbing into his truck, the officer looked back at Tony and the headmaster, suspicion still sharp. "I leave 2 men here," he said. "You continue this drill. No one leaves the school grounds, not 1 step." Then he was gone. The trucks roared away into the forest and vanished into the dark. Tony and Headmaster Martins exhaled at the same time. Their backs were slick with sweat. On the field, teachers and students stopped crying and collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard in the cold air. The teacher Jones had held earlier stood rigid, eyes wide, as if her fear had finally found a shape to cling to. At the gate, the 2 soldiers left behind stood like carved stone, rifles held ready, eyes sweeping the yard. The threat had only changed shape. After the taillights disappeared, the field remained tight with tension. The 2 guards snapped orders in German, warning no one to approach the wall. They looked less interested in civilians than in proving they were not fools, and that made them dangerous. Tony drew the headmaster close. "They won't wait long. If the patrol realizes it was a diversion, or if reinforcements come back, we lose any chance." Headmaster Martins nodded, face grim. "We have to get you out. Those 2 are the obstacle." He looked over the older students, his expression torn. "I cannot drag children into this, but now there is no clean choice." A tall, thin boy stepped forward from the group. He was 16 or 17, wearing a faded school uniform. His eyes were steady in a way Tony had seen on men twice his age. "Headmaster, Sergeant," he said in careful English. "My name is Hans. I know the back gate. There is a path into the forest and into the swamp, and I can help you deal with those 2 guards." Tony kept his voice measured. "How?" "I bring them food," Hans said, pointing toward the dining hall. "The kitchen sends a late meal to sentries. It's routine. I take food, lure them to the kitchen steps. Your men wait inside. You take them quietly." Headmaster Martins grabbed the boy's arm. "No, too dangerous. If they suspect you, they will kill you." Hans shook his head. "Headmaster, I have no family. My parents died in last year's bombing. My uncle is in the Allied zone. If the Americans leave and the Germans learn the truth, they will kill everyone here. This is not a choice. It is survival." Tony studied the boy. The determination was not theater. It was the kind that came after someone had already counted the cost. He turned to Carter. "Carter, you and Jones come with me to the kitchen. Miller and the others stay on the field. Watch. If anything turns wrong, cover the withdrawal." Carter nodded, then murmured to Tony, "You trust him?" "We do not have another option," Tony said. He looked back to Hans. "Rules." "No shooting unless there is no other way," Hans said. "They are regular soldiers, not SS. Their guard will be lower. If they die, it leaves signs that other patrols can follow. You want them alive, tied up, gone from the gate." Tony agreed. Headmaster Martins took Hans to the dining hall. The boy returned carrying a tray piled with bread and cups of milk and walked toward the guards at the gate with a practiced humility. Tony, Carter, and Jones slipped around to the dining hall's side door and pressed into shadows. Tony watched his men's breathing slow, watched hands ready themselves for a fight that could not look like a fight. "Herr Soldat," Hans said with a submissive smile, holding up the tray. "Supper." The 2 guards lowered their rifles and accepted the food without suspicion. They sat on the steps and ate hungrily. One patted Hans's shoulder and said something in German, almost casual. Tony gave a small hand signal. Carter and Jones surged out. Before the guards could stand, arms looped around their throats and pulled tight. The guards struggled, choking, bread falling from their mouths. Tony stepped in, fast and efficient. A towel stuffed their mouths. Their wrists were bound behind their backs. The three Americans dragged them into a storage room and shut the door, leaving the air inside thick with muffled rage. Hans stood in the doorway, breathing hard, sweat on his forehead. "Good work," Tony said, gripping the boy's shoulder. "Now we move." Hans nodded once. "The swamp is safest before full daylight. After sunrise, patrols increase." Tony moved quickly. The team retrieved their hidden equipment and weapons from the basement crates, redistributed gear, and checked magazines. Tony approached the young teacher. "Miss Ellis," he said, using the name he had heard in the hurried Dutch exchanges, "I'm sorry for what we did. You are safe now." She swallowed and nodded, fear replaced by a thin, strained understanding. "I understand. You were trying to live." Tony turned to the headmaster. "We are leaving. We cannot take everyone, only older students who will come and who have family in the Allied zone." Headmaster Martins walked to the students and spoke in Dutch. The field fell silent. After a moment, 7 older students stepped forward. They were like Hans, orphaned or with relatives across the front. A girl spoke with a trembling voice but steady eyes. "We will go." The headmaster reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He handed it to Tony. "A map I drew, the safe path through the swamp and the places to avoid. There are mud pits that swallow a man whole. They must follow Hans exactly." His voice was rough with something close to grief. "Take care of them." Tony accepted the map and nodded. "We will." Before they moved, Miss Ellis stepped closer with a small object in her hand, a delicate brooch. "Take this," she said. "If you reach the Allied line and see it again, you will remember that there were people in the Netherlands who were grateful for your protection." Tony did not take it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced the same brooch he had confiscated earlier. He placed it back into her palm. "It was always yours," he said. "It should stay with you. We don't need gratitude. Protecting civilians is our duty." Miss Ellis's eyes filled. She closed her fingers around the brooch as if it were warmth. At 3 in the morning, the sky was still black, with only a few stars visible through haze. Tony led his men and the 7 students out through the back gate. In the corner of the field, Headmaster Martins and the other teachers and children stood in silence, watching them go until the moving shadows dissolved into the forest. Inside the trees, fog thickened the air until visibility dropped to a few meters. Wet leaves hissed underfoot. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a bird called with a sound that raised the skin. Miller brought up the rear, glancing back again and again, as if he could see pursuit through the darkness. "Do not panic," Hans whispered as he guided them. "Fog is cover. The Germans rarely enter the swamp. They do not know it. They get lost." Tony kept the team in a tight line and signaled for quiet at every stop. He checked spacing, tapped shoulders when someone drifted, kept them moving in the rhythm of survival. Listen, step, listen, step. After nearly an hour, the trees thinned and the earth turned slick. They reached the edge of the swamp. It stretched out like a ruined sea. Green scum and reeds spread across mud that breathed. Bubbles rose and burst with a wet gurgle. The stench of rot clung to the air and crawled into the back of the throat. "Step in my prints," Hans said. Not one step outside them. He went first, moving lightly, choosing patches where grass and reeds were thick. Those spots held firmer ground. The group followed, bodies tense, boots sinking just enough to remind them what waited beneath. They had not gone far when Miller's foot slipped. His body dropped and half his leg vanished into the mud. The swamp grabbed him, heavy and cold, rising to his knees. "Help!" he shouted, panic climbing his throat as he tried to thrash free. "Do not move!" Hans yelled. "If you fight it, it pulls you down!" Tony lunged forward and lay flat on firmer ground, spreading his weight. He reached out. "Miller, take my hand. Slow. Do not jerk." Carter and two others added their weight, locking arms and bracing. Miller forced himself to breathe, then pulled steadily as Tony directed. Inch by inch, the mud released him. When he finally crawled free, he lay shaking, coated in filth, face drained white. "Every step can be a trap," Tony said. "You fall again and we may not get you back." Miller nodded without speaking. They pushed on. The swamp grew worse, the path narrower, the ground less certain. Everyone's strength drained fast. Tony glanced east. The horizon was beginning to pale. Dawn would bring new danger, and the swamp offered no cover from eyes. When the first gray light cut through the fog, Tony guided the group onto a small, relatively dry rise and ordered a brief rest. They ate what little remained, chewing in silence. Only ragged breathing and the wet burping of the swamp broke the stillness. Boots were heavy with mud. Hands shook from cold and fatigue. Miller's fingers still trembled. Carter crouched beside him and gave his shoulder a firm pat. "Kid, don't be scared. Out here, staying alive is the win." Hans suddenly went rigid, head tilting as if he had become a hunting dog. His face tightened. "Footsteps," he whispered. German voices. Everyone flattened behind the rise, peering through thinning fog. Along the swamp's edge, a patrol of more than a dozen German soldiers moved in a loose line, tracking signs on the ground. At the front, a man with binoculars swept the marsh, barking orders that carried clearly. "They're following us," Tony said under his breath. "They found the guards and tracked the trail. We're in open ground. There's nowhere to disappear." Jones leaned close, urgent. "Sergeant, do we fight?" Tony shook his head. "No, we're outnumbered, and we have students. If we trade shots, we get wiped out." The patrol drew closer. Boots squelched. Commands cut through the fog like knives. Carter rose slightly, then looked at Tony with a calm that did not belong in this place. "Sergeant," Carter said, "I'll draw them off." Tony grabbed him. "Carter, you're not doing that alone." "I am," Carter said, and gave a tired smile. He pulled a creased photograph from his pocket, looked at it once, then pressed it into Tony's hand. "I don't have anyone left. You do. Let me buy you time. Get the kids out. Follow the map. Find the Allied line." Tony's jaw clenched. "We can still make a break together." Carter shook his head. "Not with them that close. If they pin us here, it's over." Before Tony could move again, Carter smeared mud over his face, snatched up a broken branch, and sprinted away in the opposite direction. He reached a more open patch near the swamp and shouted, loud and deliberate. Then he fired a single shot. The Germans snapped toward the sound, their officer shouted, and the patrol surged after Carter, boots hammering wet ground. "Carter," Tony breathed, the word raw in his chest. Miller started to rise, but Tony forced him down with a hard grip. "We move. Now." He led the group forward, teeth grinding, the map clutched tight in Hans's hands. They slipped deeper into the swamp, keeping low, stepping where Hans stepped, trusting the boy's knowledge because there was nothing else to trust. Behind them, rifle fire erupted. Shouts in German cut through the fog. Then the gunfire dwindled and stopped. Tony felt something settle inside him, heavy as stone. Hans quickened his pace. He did not look back. The only way to honor Carter's sacrifice was to make it matter. For the next days, they pushed through the swamp in exhaustion. When they found nothing to eat, they dug up bitter wild plants. When thirst burned, they collected rainwater and filtered it as best they could. Bodies thinned, clothes tore, skin split and blistered. No one complained. Carter's choice had tied them together like a rope that could not be cut. Once a girl named Lena collapsed, her legs giving out. Miller stopped instantly, hauled her upright, and pushed half a piece of bread into her hands. She tried to refuse, shaking her head. Miller forced a smile. "Eat. We're a team. We live together." Somewhere along that miserable path, uniforms and nationalities stopped mattering. American soldiers and Dutch students became nothing but people holding each other up, one step at a time, across ground that wanted to swallow them. On the 7th morning, when the first sunlight cleared the distant horizon, Hans lifted his head and laughed, the sound almost broken with relief. "There," he said, "the Allied line." They followed his hand and saw it, a ridge in the distance with Allied flags, patrol figures moving against the sky. Tears ran down faces caked with mud. The fear and hunger that had driven them for days cracked and fell away. They supported one another and walked toward the ridge, step by step, as if afraid the sight would vanish. British soldiers spotted them and raised rifles, moving to intercept. Their posture was trained and sharp, but when they saw who it was and what condition they were in, surprise and respect crossed their faces. "We're American paratroopers," Tony rasped, producing his identification with shaking hands. "We broke out from behind German lines. The British moved fast. They gave them food, medical attention, clean clothes, and a place to rest." Warmth returned to hands that had forgotten it. The students stared at the tea and bread as if it were proof the world still had order. Afterward, it was time to separate. The 7 students were sent to a refugee camp in the Allied zone to be reunited with relatives when possible. They clung to one another, not wanting to let go of the only group that had kept them alive. Hans stepped to Tony and raised a salute that was not quite regulation but carried real weight. "Sergeant, thank you. Without you, we die." Tony returned the salute, then let his gaze pass over the surviving soldiers and the exhausted students. "We should thank you. Without you, we don't get out of that swamp." In his pocket, Tony felt the brooch, small and solid. It had become a marker of what had changed, from guns held on civilians to a bond forged under fire. He said nothing more. He gripped Hans' shoulder once, then turned and walked with his men toward the rear area camp. Months later, Tony lay in a rear hospital with bandaged wounds and a medal awarded for what the reports called bravery and withdrawal. One day, a nurse brought him a parcel with no sender's name, only a Dutch postmark. Tony opened it carefully. Inside lay the same familiar brooch and a folded note. The handwriting was neat, the English formal. "Sergeant Rosa, this is Headmaster Martins. Miss Ellis returned home safely. The school and its staff are safe. Thank you that on that night you did not let gunfire become our last memory. Your actions proved that even in war, the light of humanity does not go out. May peace come soon." Tony held the note, his eyes burning. He went to the window and looked out at the sunlight beyond the hospital grounds. In his hand he clenched the brooch until it pressed into his skin. The war was not over. But something had shifted permanently. A meeting that began in coercion had ended in shared survival. That escape on the Dutch border had taught him something he would not forget. In the worst conditions, human understanding can cross nationality, identity, and sides, and become the strongest thing keeping people alive. And that fragile bond carried across battle and mud and loss would remain in their memories as the most precious groundwork peace could ever have.